I really love economic history. And so I see it from that point of view and not from a panicked point of view about the politics of the moment. We need to look beyond that. We need to recognize that change is necessary, change is coming, there'll be issues, but I have an unshakable faith in the United States.
Threats of tariffs against China, Mexico, and Canada, and DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, taking a wrecking ball to government spending. We get into all of this and more with economist and China expert Lyric Hughes Hale. I'm Ed D'Agostino. Welcome to Global Macro Update. I'll kick it off with the three countries that are facing tariffs.
Maybe to back up a little bit with this big picture of all the change that's going on. I was thinking this morning that, this is like, for economists, this is the second real-time economic experiment that is occurring. The first in our lifetimes, and rarely do you have even one. But the first one would be, of course, what happened during COVID. Totally unexpected. And how did each country deal with it? We're still feeling the effects of that in inflation and other things that, we didn't realize. Perhaps we in the United States overreacted. I spoke to Jason Furman about that, and he felt, for example, that the third stimulus payment was a bridge too far, that shouldn't have happened. But easy to say in retrospect, and hard to know. That was a total crisis. But I think what we're going through now is another period of creative destruction, leading to also long-lived changes. And, for example, with COVID, we have now working from home, but then that's being reversed, at least for federal workers.
And financial services workers.
Exactly. So what does all this mean? The tariffs are one part of this new policy, new foreign policy, as well as economic policy. But, what are going to be the long-term consequences? I have to say that I really do support the kind of auditing that is supposed to be going on, because we do have a debt problem. And how are we going to get out of inflation? How are we going to increase growth with the enormous amount of federal debt that exists today? So are there things that we could trim? Absolutely. So looking at, for example, USAID, and my mother actually worked for USAID in Tehran as an English teacher. And my father worked for the United States Information Agency, which ran the libraries, American libraries, and programs with speakers and so forth all over the world. In 1999, USIA was shut down. And the only savings from shutting all those libraries, which were a place for people to make friends and learn about America, was $5 million. What a shame that was done. So, I'm hoping as this process occurs that we go back to first principles. What was USAID supposed to be doing? What is the projection of soft power that we should have? And a lot of that stuff doesn't cost that much money. So it appears that in that case, the mission got blurred. And they took on a lot of other roles. And this was done without people really understanding that was going on. Everybody wants to support poor children and hungry children and, help education. We all want to do that sort of thing. But was that money really being spent in that way? At first glance, it doesn't look like it as this is coming out. So with the Defense Department, another good example that they have not passed an audit in 7 years. I mean, what business would be allowed to exist year after year without being able to do that?
We should get into all of this, the whole DOGE sort of pros and cons.
Yeah. So that's just an example. So tariffs, to get back to your original question, the long way around, because I think this is a very broad discussion. I'm not convinced. Economists are actually divided on this idea. It seems that some amount of tariffs can be good for an economy, but too much can be bad. Just like any medicine we take, in a small dose, can be very effective for and help us. But if you take too much and overdose on it, you can kill yourself with it. So it's poison actually. So I think tariffs are a little like medicine. And there is no doubt that the global economic system and trade is highly imbalanced, particularly with China. $1 trillion trade surplus that's a real amount of money.
When people hear that there's $1 trillion trade surplus coming out of China, I think they assume that that's with the U.S. But how much is really with the U.S. at this point?
The thing is that Americans are the consumers of first and last resort in the world. We are the indispensable consuming nation. And especially since other countries and regions are not doing as well as the United States, let's look at Europe. Let's look at Japan. Consumption and demographics in that case, those two cases too, are very negative for consumption on a longer view. So who's going to buy all this stuff that is made? It's primarily Americans. Now, some of it is round-tripped as well. So, Apple, for example, there's some parts of Apple computers that are probably made in the US, some that are in other countries in Malaysia and so forth. The supply chain is very complex. And then they're actually manufactured in China and then sent back round trip to the US. But an American company benefits from those sales. So the picture is not that simple. But so I believe that tariffs are a form of taxation. And they are employed when domestic taxation or policy has failed. So in China, I think that the problem that China faces is not overproduction. China's problem is a lack of effective taxation. And that internal failed policy is leading America to, as Trump called it, the external revenue bureau, right? I think actually he hit it on the head. That's what it is. We're taxing China because they, of course, are supporting their industries with state money. It's a different kind of competition, and they are doing this and what some people call overproduction, flooding the market with EVs and solar panels and so forth. The reason that they're doing that is because those local governments are not able to get enough revenue on their own. So let me get a little bit into the weeds here and explain what I mean, because I think it's had profound global economic effects. Elon Musk recently said, I think today that we should get rid of property taxes. I think that is an idiotic idea for just many reasons, but it's exactly what happened in China. China doesn't have property taxes. People don't realize that. 38% of taxation in China comes from consumption versus 11 or 12% in the US. That means that the taxation system is itself depressing consumption in China and not in the United States. So they would do well to cut any kind of tax that has to do with consumption. People ask me about the real estate bubble in China. How did that happen, right? What were the factors that went into that? Well, this is why. No property taxes. So the local authorities, they have to provide services to their local residents. So they think, oh, how are we going to do that? We can't tax, so we're going to have to create projects. So they went arm in arm with property developers, leased the land that they owned, and built things in a massive misallocation of capital. Did these local officials know anything about real estate development or finance or capital markets? I can tell you no. They had no training in that. But the developers came along, they made money, and the local governments were able to supplement their income and provide those services. Now they're in terrible trouble. Local governments across China are on the brink of bankruptcy. There are many who are unable to pay their workers as well. So this is leading to all kinds of problems in China. they're not able to provide healthcare services in the way that they were, as one example. As we know, jobs are scarce in China today. But the healthcare services in particular worries me because the problems with China's healthcare systems leaked out to the rest of the world. And that's what COVID was. If their healthcare system had been open and transparent and people were able to, however it occurred in the first place, if they were able to, the doctor that was, he was not allowed to speak and he eventually died himself, they didn't want to report up the chain that what was happening. So they all covered it up.
I read recently, very recently, that in Wuhan, that it looked like COVID-19 was starting to spread locally in October of 2019, a full year. So you're saying it's not that it wasn't this master plan of the CCP to suppress information from the globe. It happened because of internal issues.
Yes. Conspiracy is a really hard thing to carry out, right? It requires a lot. It has all kinds of preconditions. I think that inefficiency or incompetence is the usual best explanation for things that happen that are not very fortunate like that. This is my particular scenario is that there were animals that were used for these experiments and then got sick and were supposed to be destroyed. But let's say it's a pig and you're the custodian. You're thinking, I'm not going to go destroy that pig or that fish or that chicken. I'm going to go take it to the local market and see if I can get a few yuan for it. I think it was that kind of thing. Once it spread, however, the local officials did not report to national officials about it. They were afraid to be transparent. So they did not have a kind of a CDC that we do, or even that South Africa was particularly good about that they reported. And then they were hurt by that because they reported so early. But I believe that if that system had worked, the reporting system for contagious diseases, and actions were taken sooner, they had months, and also traffic was stopped outside of China, air traffic stopped, it would not have spread to the rest of the world.
Sure.
China's issue then is, first of all, lack of transparency and the ineffectiveness of local governments to do what they need to do. And if they had those taxation powers, that would help them. Another problem, why don't they have that, right? You think, well, I've gone to economic symposium for 20 years where Chinese economists told me, we do need to do this. They recognize it. They know it, that this is the solution. I'm not telling them anything they don't know. But the reason they don't is because these apartments were used as the currency of corruption throughout China. So you allowed the permitting of whatever it was, this building, and as a result, your mother-in-law got an apartment. So that's why there's so many of these things all over. And higher officials and even mid-level officials own multiple properties. But the cost of owning them is zero when there's no property taxes. There's no register. Like we have Chicago Title and Trust here. We know who owns a piece of property. And the reason that we have that system is for the transfer of property, but also for property taxes. So, so that's the issue. So there was political opposition to a property tax because then suddenly there would be a cost of ownership and they would inevitably not be able to pay. And their corruption would be exposed. So this is a deeper dive when you look at the outside. Oh, what happened with the property bubble in China? It's very organic, is what I'm trying to explain.
They have sort of fallen victim to the same strategy or a similar strategy that not the U.S., but other Western nations have adopted for taxation, which is a consumption tax, or in Europe, a value-added tax, How do you compare China's system to, say, Canada or Europe's taxation strategy?
In China, those taxes are hidden from the consumers more. It's that there's so many at different levels that it's not easy for people to see them. But does it make things more expensive? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. So, because that's with just taxing income, that would not be enough to pay for everything they need to pay for, and especially their increased military budget, for example. Yeah. So, in principle, I kind of like the idea of only consumption tax because why? Because you can control that. You can decide, I'm going to buy that car or not.
And it rewards savers.
And it rewards savers. Exactly. And that gives that creates a pool of money, of capital to create new companies and new products. So yeah, in principle, I think it's a good idea, but it's just like what I said about tariffs. It's the amount that matters. A certain amount is good, but when you go over a certain other level, then it depresses the very thing that you're trying to uh, to promote.
So as we're sitting here talking, we're in the week of tariffs being announced. They may, by the time this airs, they may or may not actually go into effect, right? We
Exactly.
don't know. Things are
We
moving
don't
so
know.
fast. But you've got three countries initially targeted by the president: China, Mexico, and Canada. And what do you make of the argument that this is less about economics and more about fentanyl and the sort of the international drug trade and its influence on Canadian politics and the streets of the U.S.?
Ed, that's a very good point. And I think particularly JD Vance is very focused on this issue of fentanyl. And why those three countries? Because they all are part of the chain, right? And have we been able to keep fentanyl out of this country? No, the precursors are made in China, comes over the border from Canada, and it comes over the border, as we know, up from Mexico as well. So I think it's a good part of it, but also in the Trump administration, don't you think that there's a kind of a feeling that aggrieved that the U.S. has been paying for defense, paying for example, medical research. We pay all the costs of these things, but the rest of the world benefits, and that we've been taken advantage of. And therefore, to level the playing field and from a strategic point of view, keep production in the United States in a world that seems increasingly dangerous geopolitically, I think there's that thread to it too. So is it good? I'll give you an example. During COVID, it was very hard to get certain pharmaceutical products in the United States. I remember going for one of my kids to Walgreens and they just wouldn't have what was prescribed. There were all kinds of bottlenecks. I'm sure many people ran into that issue during that time. But 95% of those drugs come from China today. That from us, just a strategic point of view and a defense point of view, if we get into an imbroglio over Taiwan, what happens to people who depend upon those medications for their lives? I think that we should broaden that supply chain, particularly without any hesitation. And those are high value, low pollution impacting kinds of production. Uh, production. I do a lot of work in Australia, and Australia has been talking about becoming an EV capital, and making the batteries. That is very dirty production, and I don't think it will be tolerated in, as I see the Australian people would not tolerate that. But why not have Australia as an alternative place for those pharmaceuticals to be manufactured? Because they're a close ally of ours instead. So, yeah, so there's that strain of it. Part of it is fentanyl. Part of it is this need to build strategic manufacturing of critical products within our own borders. I think that's That's a no-brainer. A government should be thinking about that.
I agree with all of this. And I think there's this image among a lot of people that if we bring manufacturing back to the United States, that there's not going to be enough labor, which is a valid concern. But manufacturing is going to look very different. Pharmaceuticals, I think, would probably be a great example. I would have to think that you could automate to the nines the production of high volume pills, right? Like that should be a highly
Exactly.
automated plant.
I agree with you because then this is the impact of AI, right? Is what you're talking about. I completely agree with that. Manufacturing is not going to be like what it was in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s when it's flipped to China. And incidentally, part of the reason that that happened was not just for cheaper costs. It wasn't just the price in China. It was about regulation. So as our economy was expanding and American companies needed to expand their facilities here, that was when head to head at a time when the EPA was issuing thousands of new regulations. And that is why I think that it was the regulatory regime here in the US that is what caused the problem. Now the Trump administration is promising that they will lower those regulatory hurdles. That is essential because unless they do that, this plan will fail. And yeah, so the companies did what companies do. They didn't want to miss out on a market, and also China had its own domestic market that they could service as well. So the whole thing, it was not just that terrible American CEOs decided to strip Americans of their jobs and move to other places to get cheaper labor. That's a lot of work to move overseas and to deal with that from a distance. Yeah. So we have to look at the root causes. Here in Chicago, we have, just to give you an example, we have a train line a couple blocks from here. There's an old station. Now that this area of Chicago is booming, of course, they're talking about reopening that station. Do you know how many years is projected to get that? And the tracks are there. The old station is there. How long will it take for that station to open? What are the estimates?
I mean, you would think, okay, construction, maybe it's an old historic building, 6 months.
The projection is 10 years. 10 years. I thought I was misreading it. But so this is the issue that you've got in major cities all over. So unless we take care of that permitting part, and Chicago, of course, is notorious for permitting difficulties, let's say. But yeah, that's unacceptable. My reaction was, let's have a moratorium on everything to do with the regulation of it, and get a Chinese construction crew here. And in 6 days, we'd probably have a station too. So what I'm saying is we can't blame China for everything. A lot of there's a lot of self-inflicted pain in America.
You brought up Australia, which I think is an interesting case study because last week I interviewed a Canadian investigative journalist named Sam Cooper, he's dedicated the last 15 years of his life to investigating, started with the Vancouver real estate boom and what was driving it. And he took on the sort of conventional narrative that, well, it's just wealthy Chinese business people trying to get some assets out of the country.
Capital flight. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So that was the narrative. He dug deeper. And the deeper he dug, the more he uncovered, and the more he uncovered. Mm-hmm. And he ended up, kind of finding that a lot of that money was really money being drug money, tied back to China, being laundered through British Columbia casinos and China, and Vancouver real estate, and that there was what he called elite capture happening. So Chinese people with Chinese descent with massive amounts of wealth, um, basically buying political influence, essentially, in first in BC and then beyond. And then he points to Australia as having suffered a similar fate for a while, but then reacting to it, putting new laws in place so that they could basically push back on that sort of elite capture. Is that your experience as well?
I agree with that. And of course, Australia has the advantage that, they had a prime minister, Kevin Rudd, who spoke fluent Chinese and really knew the country very well and was able to, and knew the history and understood the Chinese Communist Party and how business worked with it. But yeah, the Australian people were very sensitive to this. I agree with that. Yeah. And so they did pass these laws. And, what they have is an influx of students now. I'm not sure of the numbers, but I think it's just like a million, this is a country of like 20 million people. So if you have 1.2 million students come in, that's a big percentage of your population too. And Australian universities, much like several American universities, without those Chinese students who pay full tuition, boarding schools around the country too have that, they would be in great difficulty. So now I think the influx is with students from China and other countries coming into Australia.
And do you think that is, again, you can go down the conspiracy road. Is there anything to be concerned about with that?
Well, a lot of these students are wealthy. And if they are, then their parents can buy them an apartment, while they're in university and come there. So some people say that the reason that property is so expensive in Australia is because of immigration and that they simply don't have enough housing. So that would be one impact.
What is your assessment, Lyric, of how China is seeing all of this? And when I say China, I want to differentiate between Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party and the people of China, because I think that it's important to distinguish between Americans and the American government, because they often think very differently.
Exactly.
So how would the two groups in China think about what's happening right now with the new administration?
I think you would have to add a third group to that. So you'd have the ordinary Chinese people and their leaders, but there's another layer to consider, which are elite Chinese. The elites, the wealthy, the very well educated, people with Western ties, like, a house in Vancouver, for example, and how they're looking at this. And they're voting with their feet. They're leaving. So I think that whenever I talk to people at that level, they are very pessimistic about the Chinese economy.
They're leaving China. They're not leaving Vancouver. Or the U.S. They're leaving China. Oh, interesting.
That's right.
Okay.
There's really a brain drain there that's going on. And, I think that because the way the system is now since Xi Jinping, that's the issue, right? It's his leadership. Before him in 2013, 2012, there were all kinds of reforms going on of the state-owned enterprises. When he came into power, all of that changed. And right now, the state-owned enterprises are in fact the biggest political bloc supporting Xi Jinping. They're the beneficiaries of how things are being done. They're positioned as national champions. Other countries can't get in and compete with them. They're given all kinds of benefits and funding too. So the state-owned enterprises, instead of becoming more competitive in the sense that we think about corporate competition, with Xi Jinping became less competitive and more part of the state apparatus. They moved away from being privatized to being more integrated into the Chinese Communist Party apparatus. And the problem with that is that you do get misallocations of capital that way. The market, and I'm a firm believer in capitalism, just to say that, and I think that communism always ends in tears, or at least it doesn't end in true economic development. So when you put that Marxist layer over everything and you don't have real competition, you don't have openness, as I mentioned before with COVID, you're creating a system that's not going to be able to compete with the rest of the world. It's one thing if China were closed off, but China is not closed off to the rest of the world. So when they're trying to, for example, help the EV industry, the EV, the cars are being flooding the markets in places like Europe, and no Chinese EVs are being sold in the United States today. That is not happening, and they're not coming here to produce. You know, I'm old enough to remember when we had a trade war with Japan, particularly over autos. And my clients were Japanese auto parts manufacturers when I was in college. And it was quite interesting to see their response to the trade frictions that were going on. And what Japan decided to do when there were tariffs and they weren't allowed to bring their cars in, they came into this market. They studied what Americans really wanted, maybe a smaller, more, a smaller car, more energy efficient car, fuel efficient car. They really studied what we wanted more than, frankly, Ford did at the time, and they really made inroads. Then they made greenfield investments and manufactured here in the US. And that made all the difference. And then you never heard of trade wars because they were employing Americans and selling within America. The Chinese should have followed that example. You know, I think that would have helped them quite a bit. They did some brownfield stuff, as we know, here in the Midwest. None of it went really well. I haven't heard of any great success stories because of the clash of the two managerial systems. But yeah, the Japanese did that right. It's ironic that we kept Nippon Steel from coming into this market. I found that I don't really understand how that happened. Japan is our ally, and that was done before Trump. That was the Biden administration who decided that they could not make an investment in U.S. steel. And I'm thinking, well, you know, it's like people who were worried about the Japanese buying Rockefeller Center. They weren't going to airlift Rockefeller Center back to Tokyo. That's impossible. And the same thing with a steel plant. So I haven't heard a good explanation of that.
Your story about Japanese car manufacturers makes me think back to a conversation I had with Harold Malmgren.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
He told me that he was consulting for Toyota in that exact time frame that you're discussing, and that he convinced them to build a plant in the U.S. and so they started looking in Michigan. And he said, "No, you don't want to go to Michigan. You want to go."
They went south.
The South. And so what a great guy and a great thinker to have on your side at that time.
I benefited from that then because the auto parts manufacturers were headquartered here in Chicago. So I learned a lot about brake linings and all this other stuff because before they brought their plants here, they brought the parts manufacturers first in. That's how they did that. So I worked with some of those companies.
And then would they ship the parts back to Japan and then the cars would come back here?
No, some of them built plants here eventually, or they would import. They made sure they had a pipeline one way or the other, that the supply chain was set up so that they could fully manufacture, because they didn't make brake linings themselves. They sourced that from another company.
I try to not ask "what do you think" questions, and I try not to opine too much. But it's sort of irresistible at this point. You mentioned that the Chinese elite are voting with their feet, that they're leaving the country. So,
right. Or if not them, their children.
Okay. So where are they going? Are they going to Australia and not leaving? Are they coming here? Where are they going, and what does this mean for the future of Xi Jinping?
Let me get back to taxation one little bit, which is another way that the Chinese government has made up for the lack of taxation is by imposing a very unpredictable fine regime. So companies and individuals and wealthy people, for no reason that they know of, are fined suddenly huge amounts of money. So this makes it very difficult to keep your wealth in China because you don't know when some official who doesn't like you, people talk about corruption in China, and many people think of it as a moral issue. I think of it as a developmental issue. Corruption happens, and when the institutions are not strong enough to perform the services for which they were intended. So people naturally try to work around it. I'm sitting in Chicago. What can I say? I'm not calling the Chinese terrible. It exists wherever you have institutional weakness. And so, yeah, in that kind of situation, just to really give more back, I'm trying to give a lot more texture to what people usually think about with China. In a system whereby everybody to get anything done has to do something illegal. They have to bribe somebody. They have to go to have a shortcut. Everybody is guilty. So everybody is in fear that they will be caught or what they did was revealed. And so the people enforcement, therefore, it's impossible to have 100% enforcement in that scenario. So you get selective enforcement. And of course, where does the enforcement happen? It happens at a political level. So if you're opposing somebody politically, this is the way that we've seen the defense officials in China and other officials, they're always accused of having followed corrupt practices or not followed the CCP or whatever. Believe me, they've done nothing different than anybody else. But this is the hook upon which So anyway, this applies to these wealthy families. And so they're getting fined. The companies that they owned will be fined. And by the way, foreign companies face the same thing, but they don't talk about it because they think it might make it worse for them operating in the country. It's like a hostage situation, right? You don't alert the media about it, but it's happening. I first thought it was just happening in foreign companies based on it, but then I found it was everybody. So this is what is spurring people to leave and where they go. And so Chinese are all over the world now, and well, they have been for a long time, right? But this is increasing.
Can you get out with the bulk of your assets?
That's a very difficult thing to do. And, I thought by the way, that is why China is so dead set against crypto, because it's a way to bypass the authorities and get your wealth out of the country.
Sure.
Interestingly, because I believe that we will live in a world where you have decentralized finance married to traditional finance. This will mean that China doesn't take part in that revolution because they've simply outlawed it. It's going to disadvantage them long term, but they can't afford the capital flight.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation. And if you are, please take a minute to subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and leave us a comment. Now back to my conversation with Lyric Hughes Hale.
All this talk about the yuan or the renminbi becoming the new currency of the world. How is that possible when they have a closed capital account and you can't move money in and out of the country? It will never become a global currency. Will it be a trading currency? Yes, but not a global investment grade currency at all, because there's too much government. And I guess that's my kind of my overview of China is there's too much government overhang over everything. That said, I think there's still a lot of support for Xi Jinping in spite of the difficulties. You'll see more demonstrations, especially from people who have lost their savings in a condominium project or in a bank, the local bank that failed, or they're not collecting their wages. You're seeing much more of that. But I think in general, for example, I have never met any Chinese person that does not support Xi Jinping's desire to regain Taiwan as part of China. Not a single person. So those are the nationalists, right? The nationalists are the one, there's still a lot of nationalism in China.
We've done China.
Yeah,
let's
we've done a lot. Okay.
let's bring it back to the US. Before we started rolling, you made some really interesting comments about what's happening in this administration, the light that's being shown on different pockets of the government, and how maybe divisions of the government that were created with the best of intentions sort of went off the rails. The whole Doge experience. Can you talk a little bit about some of what you're seeing and what maybe you think is good about it and not so good about it?
In economics, we always talk about creative destruction, right? And I think we're going through, there is a combination of the pendulum swinging back, um, and in a political sense, but there are some things that just maybe couldn't, with our national debt, for example, the amount of spending that was going on. And, we talked about, the Department of Defense not passing an audit for 7 years. That is not possible in corporate America, for example. And we're talking trillions of dollars of taxpayer money. I think every effort to do audits of all of these departments and make them answerable and all of their accounts answerable, that's a wonderful thing. We should be doing that. And people should understand where they're spending money. And in some cases, there are a lot of anecdotes about really frivolous things, putting shrimp on treadmills to see how long they last. I mean, I'm sorry. I don't want to pay for that. I don't want to even think about that. I feel sorry for the shrimp. It's terrible that but that happens over time. So it's good to go through the closet, right? Check what we're doing. But also, I think there's another issue, which is a technological issue and a strategic issue. All of government's um, IT systems are totally antiquated. They're totally susceptible. The Treasury Department has been hacked. That's not what should be happening.
Treasury Department, the FBI, anybody who's been on the Treasury Direct website to try and buy a bond can tell you that the website looks like it was made in 1974. I mean, it's embarrassing how far behind we are.
The IRS has the worst IT infrastructure possible, and they should be functioning because they're collecting money. They should have the best infrastructure because they're revenue producing. They're not just spending money. They're the ones bringing it in. So why wouldn't you want to do that? So I'm hoping that the so-called tech bros, I am sure they're horrified. They had no idea sitting in Silicon Valley how bad things are in DC, right under the cover. So I'm very, that's going to lead to productivity gains, and to hopefully lessening our debt if we're not spending so much money. Much harder to, it's much easier to stop spending some of that money than to create new revenue sources, which is very politically charged experience, right? And yet they're talking about getting rid of the income tax, getting rid of property taxes. You can't do that unless you cut a lot of fat. But maybe, as we mentioned, the VAT, some sort of consumption tax instead that people have in their own control. Problem is that, that's disproportionate. People who, and maybe you can fix that by making those taxes less on food, less on fuel, so that poorer families, for example, who weren't paying much or any income taxes before, wouldn't suddenly be having a new burden to deal with. Yeah. So I'm excited about, the audits, and I'm excited about repairing our IT infrastructure in Washington. Those are necessary things to do, no matter, and I'm sure people won't like it.
Yeah, and the other thing that chunk of the country is upset about is the role of Elon Musk, right? And how he is just sticking his nose into so many corners of the government. and what it means for a billionaire to be so deeply involved. And I'm not too upset about it. I mean, I think Elon is a complex person and has many great qualities and some really not so great qualities. But at least we know who's doing it.
It's clear. Yeah.
Right. I mean, at least it's there. We know who's doing it and we know what his mandate is versus the sort of faceless, anonymous lobbyists working in the shadows and feeding off of taxpayer dollars for decades now or longer.
We get all involved in people's personalities, in their character traits and all that. And, that's for their family to deal with and their friends, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
I don't have to deal with that. But I think Elon Musk is a transformational figure. And he has proven that he understands technology. He can deploy and commercialize technology. He really is not, and he's created jobs, tens of thousands of jobs. Tell me which bureaucrat in Washington has done that, other than adding more levels of bureaucracy. I was speaking to a group of young Australians and Americans, and they were saying, well, we should tax Elon Musk more, take more of his money away. And I said, okay, so we're here in Washington and there's Treasury down the street. Do you think by taking some of his money and giving it to those guys that they're going to figure out a better way of using that money and create more jobs and better technology than Elon Musk? So maybe it's unfair that he's the richest man in the world. That also means that his motivation is not to become richer. I find it amazing that the Congress, for example, is allowed to trade stock. That is unbelievable to me. And, today I saw Mitch McConnell or whatever. I'm not picking on him. I don't have a beef against him, but he, for the last 30 years has made $174,000 a year. He is now worth $150 million through stock trades. So they're the people who make the laws that regulate these companies. This is something, as I said, I talk about corruption in China. This is a misalignment of incentives. That's what it is. Huge. So we need to take that away. So people always are saying to me, oh, Trump, he just is doing this to make himself richer. They don't get the hierarchy of I think how human beings work. Both of those men already have achieved massive personal fortunes. They're looking at something else. They're looking at that step beyond making money. And I think that's a good thing. And they know how to make money. People making the rules that have never signed the front of a paycheck ever in their lives and have had the same salary every 2 weeks for decades, I don't think they get what the engine of growth is here, like in the Midwest. Small businesses and family businesses, they have never had those worries. They have never had those concerns. And that's why we are where we are today.
You say it's why we are where we are today, and yet there's a big have not issue in this country too, right? Like for some, life's gotten pretty comfortable, but for others, it's arguably uncomfortable. Any thoughts on that?
There's been discussion of universal basic income, for example, to give people. I personally don't believe it. In economics, the worst idea possible.
Where's your sense of self-worth if you just get a check in the mail?
There has to be incentive to work. There has to be. And I agree with you. A job is more than money. A job is self-worth, and it's your community. And, it's just so much more than that. So in this country, though, I mean, really, opportunity is still available to everybody. I think, to give you one example, our system of community colleges, where you can go back and get something like a very high paying degree, like in nursing. There's a program all over this country. There's a shortage of nurses. And yet you can get that education basically for free throughout the community college system in this country. It's set up. Not enough people take advantage of that. And yeah, it's hard work, but there are upskilling opportunities. That was a problem when all of these jobs left. The role of the government should have been to realize that they could have made an investment in reskilling the people who lost those jobs. Once it happened, and they did not. And you see, if you know, read Hillbilly Elegy or whatever, here in the Midwest, we had so much of that. And people's lifetime earnings, their lifetime health was impacted. Now in this country, we have, you know, for men, longevity is falling. How is that possible when we spend 20% of our GDP on healthcare, for example, that are that we're less healthy than we would be? So that would be another. I don't know if RFK is going to get confirmed tomorrow or not. I don't know if his solutions are the best or he's the right person, but I don't care. Something needs to be done about chronic disease in this country.
Yeah. Something different
It's
than what has been.
That's
Yeah.
right. And maybe they'll fail, you know, there'll be experimentation. This is the age of economic experimentation in all of these. It's fascinating for me. I'm not partisan. I'm kind of like watching the wheels go round and round here. But, you know, what a time to be alive with this level of change. And with AI, robotics, I firmly believe that people do not know how fast this is coming.
Weeks feel like years lately. Yeah.
As Lennon said, right? There's some years that feel like a day or whatever weeks, and there's some weeks that feel like years. We're in one of those times right now, but it makes me hopeful. We're not stuck.
You do some really important work at EconView. Tell me a little bit about how viewers can find you, your podcast, and learn more about you.
Thank you so much for asking it. EconVue is spelled EconVue, and we are moved our website to Substack about 18 months ago, which was a very good decision. Substack is becoming the place to go for a lot of writers. It's really a new media platform. If your viewers are and listeners are not already members of Substack, I would highly. It's nonpartisan as well. All kinds of thinking is going on, but our website is there. And we have newsletters, articles by multiple EconView contributors from all over the world. We recently did a panel on AI to get perspectives on that, for example. So we have panels, we have articles, newsletters, viewpoints. And then I also, as you mentioned, do a podcast called The Hale Report. And I get to talk to very interesting people every place, and it's free to join. So, you know, please join us.
I love speaking with you because, or just being on a call with you, because you have a very calming presence. When I hear you speak, I just think everything is going to be okay. And so that's a great quality to have.
Thank you. I think it's because, you know, maybe I have the historical perspective. I really love economic history. And so I see it from that point of view and not from a panicked point of view about the politics of the moment. We need to look beyond that. We need to recognize that change is necessary. Change is coming. There'll be issues, but I have an unshakable faith in the United States that there's no place like us. I would never, you know, two people talking about leaving, I'm like, okay, where would you go? Where you would get this level of opportunity and freedom, but we have to fight to keep it fresh.
That's a great message to end on.